Hello and welcome to my channel if you're new here, and welcome back if you've been here before. In this video I'm going to be making 3 different meals. 2 of them are chili and one of them is a pork chops meal, and 2 of them are done in the crock pot. So this gives some options as far as how you want to cook the food, if you want to do crock pot meals or if you want to do on the stove. But I grew up in Cincinnati, and so I absolutely love Cincinnati chili, so that's the first one that I'm going to be cooking. And then after that I'll follow up with the Texas chili in the crock pot, and then the pork chops with apples also in the crock pot. And that was just one because I thought I'd do something nice with pork chops. So the first one here is Cincinnati chili. I grew up in Cincinnati, so I absolutely love Cincinnati chili. So you start out with the tomato paste. It's 1 can. You dump that into the pot, and then you start cooking that on a low temperature, and you cook it just enough until it smells rich and kind of toasty. So that takes about 2 minutes or so, and then once you get it cooked, you're going to remove it from the heat. So this first part here you see is me just making sure to get all the tomato paste out of the can. I decided to use a knife for that. I didn't have a small spatula, so the butter knife did well enough getting as much of it as I could out of the pan, and just sort of get it scraped off the knife and stirred around. But this is the first step. So you start out with the tomato paste and getting that sort of rich and toasty smelling in the pan. Okay, so now that's getting nice and rich and toasty. So in just a moment here, you're going to see me move it off of this burner because we don't want to be actively heating the tomato paste for the next 2 steps. And what you're going to need is 4 cups of water, and you'll need your ground beef, which is 2 pounds. So here you see me pouring in the water, and then after that I'm going to cut open the packs of meat and mix that in there too. But I wanted to make sure to sort of get the water and the tomato paste at least mixed a little bit. So I have these separately packaged hamburgers. So I got the first packet out, and basically what you do is you kind of crush the hamburger in your fingers as you're putting it into the pot. And if it's not completely sort of crushed going into the pot, then after I put it in the pot, I'll still stick my hands in there, kind of smush it around and get it to really break down, because you don't want it to be in chunks. A lot of people make a joke about how Cincinnati chili is more of a meat sauce than it is a chili, which I guess there is some truth to that, but it tastes like chili, so it's a chili. But yeah, I'm going to smush the meat around a lot into the pot, trying to get it to break up, and any pieces I see that didn't really break up, I'll go into the pot and break it up with my hand, which not the greatest feeling in the world. I really hate sort of getting messy foods all over my hands, but you do what you have to do in order to make the food turn out right. Now for the next step, I'm moving the pot back over to the burner that has the heat on. So we're going to really get cooking again, since the other burner was not on, and just to add the water and the meat. And now we're actively getting into the actual cooking process. So I'm just stirring the meat and the water mixture around with the cooked tomato paste, getting it all mixed together. And now I'm putting in the 8-ounce can of tomato sauce. These are actually some ingredients I'm kind of keeping around my house regularly right now because I love chili and want to be able to make it, on a regular basis, probably at least twice a month. So that was the tomato sauce in there. And the next ingredients that I'll be adding will be the large onion chopped up and the garlic. It's 6 cloves of garlic that I put into this. And I actually had the Pampered Chef mincer that removes the skin and actually crushes the garlic, and I love that thing, and so I used that. But I'm guessing you could probably also use the minced garlic that you can get in a container at the store. Either one will probably work, but I've heard that actually mincing the garlic gives it more flavor. And now onto the spices. So of the spices, there is chili powder, which is 3 tablespoons. So I start with that, and then after that, you're going to have the teaspoon of cumin, which we're not quite there yet, but I figure it doesn't hurt to give you a rundown of the various spices that I'm using. I'll also put in the description as far as what spices we're using. So this is the teaspoon of cumin. The chili powder is 3 tablespoons. The cumin is 1 teaspoon. After that is cinnamon, and it's 1 teaspoon of that as well. And then after the cinnamon, the next spice is going to be ground allspice, and that one's going to be 3/4 of a teaspoon. So it's a little bit more of a guesswork type of thing when doing that, because I don't know of any teaspoon that has just 3/4 to it. And I wasn't going to do like a half teaspoon and 1/4 teaspoon measurement, so I just took the 1 teaspoon and filled it about 3/4 of the way, and I figured that would work. And then after that is the 1/4 teaspoon of cloves, and that's ground cloves. So I actually did use the 1/4 teaspoon for that one. And then after that, there is the half teaspoon of cayenne. And I had to look at a lot of grocery stores. Walmart has that, and the local grocery store here had it, but I checked 2 other grocery stores, and they didn't have it. And so after that is 2 teaspoons of salt, and we have the pink Himalayan salt in the grinder. And I tend to just have to, grind it, to put it on food or in recipes. So I literally will usually grind out the salt into one of our red plastic bowls and then measure it out from there. So if you see me cooking and there's the red bowl, that's where I grinded the salt into before measuring it out. So that's going to be 2 teaspoons of salt. A lot of times if a recipe calls for more than 1 teaspoon, I'll go ahead and grind it out, because it's easier to get the measurement that way than trying to guess at it. I can usually guess at 1 teaspoon, but I don't want to chance it with 2 teaspoons. And then I've always been taught that Cincinnati chili has bay leaves in it, and so the recipe I got did not have those listed, but I tossed them in there anyway, 5 of them, because that's what I've always been told the Cincinnati chili has is 5 bay leaves in it. And after the bay leaves, there's also you'll see in a moment, Worcestershire sauce, which I've heard discussion about how that's pronounced. I knew a guy that was from England, and he said the proper pronunciation was Worcestershire, so that's how I've always pronounced it since then. And there's going to be 2 tablespoons of that. And then one of the things that Cincinnati chili is famous for is the quote chocolate in it, which is cocoa. So I put in 1 ounce, which I believe was like 2 tablespoons of cocoa. So that was the ingredient you just saw in there. I used the Hershey's cocoa for that. And so just stirring it around, and basically once you get all the ingredients in, you're just going to let it sit and cook for like 2 to 3 hours. As I go along, typically I will sort of sample it and taste it and see how it tastes. And if I don't think it has quite the right flavor, I'll try and figure out which flavor it needs and add a little bit more of that. There's the Worcestershire sauce now. Sometimes I'll add a little bit more of the cloves or allspice. Sometimes the Worcestershire sauce. It just depends when I'm making it, what I think it's lacking. A lot of times I've added extra salt. So as you're cooking this, be sure to sample it and taste it. And if you say, oh, well, I don't know what Cincinnati chili is supposed to taste like, you're wanting it to taste good to you. So flavor it that it tastes good to you. And now for the next part of the process, and what's Cincinnati chili without everything that goes with it? And so spaghetti is in order. So I'm just cooking up the spaghetti to go with it. In this case, I'll be making a 4-way, because I found out from the last time I made Cincinnati chili, my husband doesn't like beans in his food apparently, or at least not in Cincinnati chili. Like even when he would eat Chipotle or Hothead, he won't get beans on his bowl. He just won't. So in this case, I made the chili and skipped the beans for him, even though I love the beans personally, and set everything up for a 4-way. And that would be the spaghetti, the meat, onions, and cheese. And so this is me just getting the spaghetti part ready, because this will go underneath the meat on the plate. But since I'm using the big pot for the chili, I used the next largest one for the spaghetti. So a little bit smaller than can accommodate the noodles, but it works. And then this next step that you're going to be seeing is the onions. And so I'm going to chop up an onion, and that'll go on top of the chili when I set everything up. So this is one large onion, and I'm just chopping that up the usual way, crossways, and then down the side in order to basically dice the onions. Prefer to have the cheese grated by hand, so this is extra sharp cheddar cheese, which I think tastes the closest, or this is probably close if not what they use at like Skyline and Gold Star for the Cincinnati Chili. They might just use sharp, but at Sam's Club they don't have just sharp, they have extra sharp, and it tastes delicious and it grates well, so this is what I've been using. So now I am just stirring around in the pot and trying to find the bay leaves to take them out, because you take them all out before you serve the chili, because otherwise the bay leaves can cut your mouth and that's never fun. So try and make sure to sort of stir around and find the bay leaves and get them out before you serve it. If it goes into like the freezer to be stored or the fridge, that's not too big a deal. In fact, when it solidifies a little bit, it'll make it easier to find the bay leaf. But when you're going to be eating it, it's just better to get it out so that no one cuts their mouth. So I did end up finding all 5, so it wasn't that big of a deal. But yeah, it's just a little tiny bit of work stirring around and finding those bay leaves. And so that is it for the chili. As you can see, it turned out rather lovely. I think I cooked this one for about 2.5 hours or so before it was pretty much ready to eat. The longer you cook it, the more the flavor will intensify, but even after like 2 hours, it still tastes good and it's ready to go. Now on to the Texas chili, which I made this by my husband's request because he doesn't care so much for Cincinnati chili, but he loves Texas chili, and he especially loves it on cold winter days, and it's been cold here. In fact, it snowed just a few days ago, and so I made this actually while there was snow still on the ground. I've made it 2 times now, and he absolutely loved it the first time, so I figured I'd make it a repeat. So you start out basically with onions and garlic and the meat all in a pan. I've seen some recipes where it talks about sauteing the onions and the garlic in oil, olive oil specifically, but I know that the fat from the meat can also cook the onions, and I think it gives better flavor that way. So that's what I did. I basically started out with the onions and the garlic, and I used minced garlic that I bought from Sam's Club as opposed to just using the cloves because I was out of the cloves, and this worked just as well. So I have the onions and the garlic in the pan, and then I'll put the hamburger in and start cooking that. And just like the Cincinnati chili recipe, this calls for 2 pounds of ground beef. Now, for the Cincinnati chili, you're going to want to use a heavier 80-20 meat, so a higher fat level. But for the Texas chili, you can use a leaner meat because it really doesn't matter. You only need a little bit of the fat to saute the onions and garlic. So you could go for, say a 90-10 or, a higher level of the 85, I guess, to use in the Texas chili because it doesn't need as high a fat content as the Cincinnati chili does. And now that the meat is all browned and the onions are cooked so they're sort of nice and soft and the garlic has been cooked and incorporated in, I'm going to get ready to set it up in the crock pot. So the last thing you do before putting in the crock pot, per the directions that I had, you add chili powder. So there's a total of 3 tablespoons of chili powder that go in this, but while it's still in the pan on the first part, you put in 1 tablespoon. So I have 1 tablespoon of chili powder that I'm putting in here, and I'm going to stir that around. And once it's all mixed together and incorporated, then I'm going to go ahead and transfer it into the crock pot. Now this is where the crock pot process begins. So I'll be dumping all of the hamburger, onion, garlic mixture into here, and it's already got its base flavoring of the chili powder. And then once I get it all mixed into the crock pot here, that's when I'm going to start adding the spices and the tomato sauce and the other ingredients. I'll be adding beans in here. You can use different kinds of beans, but in the recipe I have, it calls for light kidney beans, dark kidney beans, and black beans. And the last time I made it, I had a can of light kidney beans, black beans, and pinto beans, but I didn't have any of the dark kidney beans, so I just went with that can because that was what I had. So as you saw here, the first can was kidney beans, and then I'm adding the black beans there, and now I'm adding the diced tomatoes. So this is a can of Rotel diced tomatoes with mild green chilies, and I'd seen a recipe where you could or could not use the chilies. It depended on the flavor you wanted and how much heat you wanted in it. So I opted for the mild chilies, and I had 1 can with the chilies already in it and 1 can that didn't, but I also had a can of green chilies. So I got that and used that, and unfortunately when I was opening up the can on the counter, I grabbed the can to go put it in the crock pot and it tipped over, and so half the chili spilt out. So basically what ended up in here was 1 can of the diced tomatoes with green chilies, a can of diced tomatoes, and then a half can of the green chilies. And then you just saw me add the tomato sauce, and now I'm starting in with the spices. So I'm adding the chili powder and the cumin, and I'll be adding in, let's see, onion powder and garlic powder and brown sugar and salt. And so that's what I'm adding in here. I actually had to run down to my basement because I only had 1 tablespoon left of the chili powder in my small bottle, and I had a larger container in the basement, so I had to run down and get that real quick so I could put in the other tablespoon of the chili powder. But you're going to want 2 tablespoons of cumin, 1 tablespoon of onion powder, 1 tablespoon of brown sugar, a half tablespoon of garlic powder, which I did 1 because we like our garlic, and then a half tablespoon of the salt. And so I basically grinded the salt in there and then added a little bit more as I went along because the salt is really more of a to taste type of thing. And the finished product turned out great, and my husband and I absolutely loved it, and my daughter even likes it, which is impressive because she's kind of picky on things. So that is the Texas chili there that I did in the crock pot, and that was on high heat for 2 to 3 hours. And now for the last recipe, the pork chops with apples. And I started out doing this recipe. I used, I believe, 3 apples, maybe 4. I washed them off and then used the apple slicer to cut them all apart and take out the core. And my husband actually got this nice little gadget, and I used it for all the apples that I used for this meal. This is actually similar to another crock pot meal that I've done. I haven't done a video for it yet, but another crock pot meal that I did that had sweet potatoes and apples. It's similar but different, and both taste great. And so I started out by cutting the apples. I did 4 apples, and then I moved on to the pork chops. So once I had all the apples cut and cored, I dumped them into the crock pot and just had them waiting for the next step, which was preparing the pork chops. So with the pork chops, according to the recipe, I needed to salt and pepper each side of them, and then after salt and peppering them, I needed to dredge them in flour. However, I did not feel like messing up 2 plates, so instead of that, I just put the salt and pepper on them, and then I sprinkled the flour over them, and then I flipped them over and pressed them into the flour that had fallen in the plate, and also scooped up that flour and sprinkled that over the pork chops. So I mean, it was probably a little bit more tedious this way, but it was kind of worth it to me to not mess up a second plate in order to do this. So it worked just as well, and the pork chops were seasoned. And the interesting thing about this is, normally when I make pork chops, I'll season the flour. So with this recipe calling for seasoning the pork chops first, I thought that was kind of interesting, but I don't think it really has an effect either way on the taste of the pork chops or the flavoring. Aside from when you salt and pepper the flour, it might make the salt and pepper flavor come out a little bit more than it did with directly seasoning the pork chops. Now for the initial cooking of the pork chops. So what I did here is in my stainless steel pan, I put some olive oil in order to cook the pork chops, and I had that already heated up so the olive oil was nice and hot. And then I took the pork chops and made sure they were fully coated with the flour, and then put each one of them into the pan. And you cook those probably 2-3 minutes on each side. It's just enough to get the flour and the outside of the pork chop to cook. It's not really cooking the inside at all. It's just basically getting the flour coating and the outside of the pork chop cooked. And you cook, like I said, that on each side for about 2-3 minutes. And then once that's done, we'll transfer them over to the crock pot. So now back over to the apples in the crock pot. It's time to add about 1/2 to 3/4 of a cup of brown sugar to the apples, so that way they have the brown sugar sweetening them while they are cooking. And now that I've added the brown sugar, which is 1/2 cup according to the recipe, it's time to add 1 teaspoon of ground cinnamon. And then after that, we'll also add 1/2 cup of apple juice, but getting the cinnamon in there first. So next I'm stirring the brown sugar and the cinnamon around with the apples before going back over to the pork chops. So back over to the pork chops, and at this point I'm going to remove all 3 of them from the pan and put them on a plate, and then I'll take them over to the crock pot where I'll layer them over top of the apples. Now that all the pork chops are in on top of the apples, we'll pour in the apple juice, and that's 1/2 cup of apple juice. That's what I was talking about earlier. So we'll pour in the apple juice. It doesn't have to be any particular brand, just 1/2 cup. And so we'll pour that in with the pork chops, the apples, the cinnamon, and the brown sugar. Now that everything's cooked, I take the lid off and check it out. The pork chops turned out great, and when I took them out and put them on the plate, the pork literally fell off the bone and was absolutely delicious. So thank you for watching this video. Please like and subscribe if you haven't yet, and I will see you in my next video.